The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Clara Bennett walked home from school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her mind buzzing with the day's lessons. At 15, she was a dreamer, her head often filled with stories she scribbled in the margins of her notebooks. She wanted to be a writer someday, to tell stories that would make people feel something, joy, hope, even sadness. But for now, she was just a girl navigating the complexities of high school, step-family dynamics, and the quiet ache of growing up too fast. Clara lived in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her home was a modest house on the edge of town, where she lived with her mother, Evelyn, and her stepfather, Robert. Evelyn was Clara's rock, the one person who always seemed to understand her. She was gentle and kind, with a smile that could light up even the darkest days. Robert, on the other hand, was a different story. He was strict, often cold, and quick to anger. Clara had never felt close to him, and over the years, she had learned to keep her distance. That afternoon, as Clara walked the familiar path home, she noticed how the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. She loved this time of year, when the world seemed to slow down and everything felt a little quieter. But as she turned down a secluded stretch of road, her peaceful thoughts were shattered. A man stepped out from behind a tree, his presence sudden and menacing. Clara's heart raced as she tried to quicken her pace, but he was faster. He grabbed her, his grip like iron, and before she could scream, he silenced her. The world seemed to stop as Clara's mind went blank, her body frozen in fear. When it was over, he was gone as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Clara trembling on the ground, her clothes torn, her spirit shattered. She didn't remember how she got home that day. The walk was a blur, her legs moving on autopilot as tears streamed down her face. When she finally stumbled through the front door, her mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. Evelyn took one look at Clara and dropped the spoon she was holding. "Clara, what happened?" Evelyn rushed to her daughter, her voice filled with panic. Clara collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Evelyn held her tightly, her own tears falling as she whispered, "It's going to be okay. We'll get through this together." But Robert's reaction was far from comforting. When Evelyn told him what had happened, his face turned red with anger. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's reputation?" he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "How could you let this happen?" Clara flinched at his words, feeling as though she had been struck. She wanted to disappear, to escape the shame and guilt that now clung to her like a second skin. Evelyn tried to defend her, but Robert's anger was unrelenting. "This is her fault," he said coldly. "She should have been more careful." The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. Clara stopped going to school, too afraid to face the world. She spent most of her time in her room, curled up in bed, trying to block out the memories that haunted her. But then, a new fear began to take root, one that made her stomach churn with dread. When Clara missed her period, she tried to convince herself it was just stress. But as the weeks passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. She was pregnant. The day she told her mother, Evelyn held her close and promised they would figure it out together. But when Robert found out, his reaction was even worse than before. "You've ruined this family," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "I won't have you bringing shame to this house." Clara's heart sank as she realized what was coming next. Robert grabbed her arm and dragged her to the door, throwing her out into the cold night. "Don't come back," he said, his voice cold and final. Clara stood on the doorstep, clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her face. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The streets were her only option now. As she walked away from the only home she had ever known, she made a silent promise to the baby growing inside her. She would protect this child, no matter what it took, even if it meant giving up everything she had left. The storm had come, and it had taken everything from her. But somewhere deep inside, Clara clung to a tiny flicker of hope, a hope that one day, the sun would shine again. The streets were cold and unforgiving, but Clara had no choice but to keep moving. She wandered aimlessly for hours, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do. She was only 15, pregnant, and alone. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, but she refused to give up. She had to find shelter, not just for herself, but for the baby growing inside her. Eventually, Clara stumbled upon a small women's refuge on the outskirts of town. The sign outside read, "Safe haven for women in need." She hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her desperation, but the thought of her unborn child gave her the courage to step inside. The refuge was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold world outside. A kind woman named Margaret greeted her at the door, her eyes filled with compassion. "You're safe here," Margaret said softly, guiding Clara to a chair. "Let's get you something to eat and a warm bed to sleep in." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The refuge became her temporary home, a place where she could rest and begin to heal. She met other women there, each with her own story of pain and survival. They shared meals, tears, and laughter, forming a bond that helped Clara feel less alone. Despite the support she found at the refuge, Clara's fear and uncertainty never fully went away. She was still just a child herself, and the thought of becoming a mother was terrifying. But as the weeks passed and her belly grew, she began to feel a deep connection to the life inside her. She would sit for hours, her hands resting on her stomach, whispering promises to her baby. "I'll protect you," she would say. "No matter what happens, I'll always love you." When the time came for Clara to give birth, she was surrounded by the women from the refuge, who had become like family to her. Margaret held her hand as she labored, offering words of encouragement and comfort. And then, after hours of pain and exhaustion, Clara heard the sound of her baby's first cry. Tears streamed down her face as the nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms. "It's a boy," the nurse said with a smile. Clara looked down at her son, her heart swelling with love. He was perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and the tiniest fingers she had ever seen. She named him Samuel, after her grandfather, the man who had always been a source of strength and kindness in her life. For the next few weeks, Clara and Samuel were inseparable. She spent every moment with him, memorizing every detail of his face, the sound of his cries, the way he curled his tiny hand around her finger. She cherished every second, knowing that their time together was limited. As much as Clara loved Samuel, she knew she couldn't give him the life he deserved. She was still just a teenager, with no job, no home, and no way to provide for him. The thought of giving him up was unbearable, but she knew it was the only way to ensure he had a chance at a better future. One evening, as Samuel slept peacefully in her arms, Clara made the agonizing decision to give him up for adoption. She sat down with a pen and paper, her hands trembling as she began to write a letter to her son. "My dearest Samuel, I want you to know how much I love you. You are the most precious thing in my life, and letting you go is the hardest thing I will ever do. But I want you to have a life full of love, opportunity, and happiness, a life I can't give you right now. Please know that this decision comes from a place of love, and that I will always carry you in my heart. I hope one day you will understand and forgive me. With all my love, your mother, Clara." The next day, Clara handed Samuel over to a social worker, her heart breaking as she watched him leave. She held him one last time, kissing his forehead and whispering, "I love you, Samuel. Always." As the door closed behind them, Clara collapsed into Margaret's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The days that followed were some of the darkest of Clara's life. She felt empty, as though a part of her had been ripped away. But even in her grief, she held on to the hope that Samuel was out there somewhere, safe and loved. She prayed that one day, he would find his way back to her. The sacrifice Clara made that day was one of the most selfless acts of love a mother could give. She gave up her son so that he could have a better life, even though it meant enduring a pain that would stay with her forever. And as she began to rebuild her life, she carried Samuel's memory with her, a beacon of hope that one day the storm would pass and the sun would shine again. The years after Samuel's adoption were a blur of struggle and survival for Clara. She moved to a new city, determined to start over. She found work as a waitress, then as a receptionist, and eventually as a bookstore clerk. The job at the bookstore became her sanctuary, surrounded by the stories she had always loved. She lived a quiet life, keeping to herself, but the ache of losing Samuel never fully faded. Every year on his birthday, she would light a candle and whisper a prayer for him, hoping he was happy and loved. Clara never married or had other children. She dated occasionally, but no one ever came close to filling the void in her heart. She often wondered about Samuel, what he looked like, what he was doing if he ever thought about her. She dreamed of the day she might see him again, though she knew it was unlikely. The world was a big place, and she had no way of finding him. All she could do was hold on to the hope that he was out there somewhere, living a good life. Meanwhile, Samuel had grown up in a loving home with adoptive parents who cherished him. They had always been honest with him about his adoption, telling him that his birth mother had made the ultimate sacrifice out of love. Samuel had a happy childhood, excelling in school and showing an early talent for entrepreneurship. By the time he was in his 20s, he had started his own tech company, which quickly grew into a billion-dollar empire. Despite his success, Samuel always felt a piece of him was missing. He had everything: wealth, fame, and admiration, but he couldn't shake the longing to know where he came from. When he turned 30, he decided to begin the search for his birth mother. He hired a private investigator and spent years following leads, hitting dead ends, and never giving up hope. Then one day, the investigator called with news. "We found her," he said. "Her name is Clara Bennett." Samuel's heart raced as he read the report. Clara was living in a small apartment in the city, working at a bookstore. She had never married or had other children. The investigator handed him an address, and Samuel knew what he had to do. He sat down and wrote a letter, pouring his heart onto the page. "Dear Clara, my name is Samuel, and I believe I am your son. I've spent years searching for you, wanting to thank you for the sacrifice you made so that I could have a better life. I would love to meet you, to hear your story, and to finally know the woman who gave me life. If you're willing, I'll be at the address below next Saturday at noon. I hope to see you there. With love, Samuel." When Clara received the letter, her hands trembled so much she could barely read it. Tears streamed down her face as she realized her prayers had been answered. Samuel had found her. He wanted to meet her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. The day of the reunion, Clara stood outside the cafe Samuel had mentioned in his letter, her heart pounding. She had spent hours getting ready, choosing her best dress, and fixing her hair, though she knew none of that mattered. What mattered was the moment she had waited for her entire life. When Samuel arrived, Clara recognized him immediately. He had her eyes, her smile, and a quiet confidence that took her breath away. They stood there for a moment, just staring at each other, before Samuel stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. Clara clung to him, tears streaming down her face. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son." They sat together for hours, talking and crying, sharing stories of their lives. Samuel told her about his childhood, his career, and his search for her. Clara told him about the day he was born, the love she had for him, and the pain of letting him go. They laughed, they cried, and they began to heal the wounds of the past. From that day on, Samuel became a constant presence in Clara's life. He helped her move into a beautiful home, gave her financial stability, and introduced her to his world. But more than that, he gave her the family she had always longed for. They spent holidays together, celebrated milestones, and created new memories that filled the void of the years they had lost. For Clara, the reunion with Samuel was more than just a dream come true. It was a second chance at life. She had endured so much pain and loss, but in the end, she had found her son, and with him, a love that would last a lifetime. Together, they built a new chapter of their lives, united by an unbreakable bond and the knowledge that, no matter how dark the storm, the sun would always rise again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comment section. See you in the next video.